Jonathan Sterling believed the world was a machine, and money was the oil that made it run. His mansion was a monument to this belief, a cold cathedral of glass and steel perched on a hill overlooking the city. Every surface gleamed with the polish of paid hands. Every room was a curated gallery of his success. He moved through these spaces not as a man living in a home, but as a warden patrolling a pristine, valuable prison. His most precious inmate was his own son, Leo. Leo was 7 years old, a small, silent ghost in the cavernous halls. Since his mother had left 2 years prior, a quietness had fallen over the boy, a thick blanket of silence that Jonathan found both irritating and inconvenient. Doctors had offered diagnoses, therapists had suggested strategies, but Jonathan Sterling had no patience for things that could not be bought or bullied into submission. He needed a solution, a functionary, someone to manage the Leo problem, so he could focus on the more important business of acquiring more of everything. That was why Eleanor Vance was here. She was a stark contrast to the sterile environment of the Sterling estate. An older black woman with kind lines etched around her eyes and hands that looked like they had spent a lifetime tending to things, not just polishing them. Her presence was soft, unassuming, a patch of warm earth in a landscape of polished stone. To Jonathan, she was just the help. He had hired her based on a recommendation from an agency, barely glancing at her resume, which he assumed was a patchwork of similar domestic jobs. He saw her simple clothes, her quiet demeanor, her race, and he filed her away in a mental category labeled unimportant. She was a tool, a function. Her purpose was to make Leo less of a problem. But a month into her employment, the problem had not been solved to his satisfaction. Leo was still quiet, still withdrawn. And Jonathan, a man who trusted no one, began to nurture a suspicion, a dark and ugly seed planted in the fertile ground of his prejudice. He started to notice things, or rather, he started to interpret things through his own warped lens. He saw Eleanor speaking to Leo in low, gentle tones, and imagined she was filling his son's head with nonsense. He saw her holding Leo's hand as they walked in the garden and perceived it as a violation, an overstepping of her station. When a small, insignificant silver trinket went missing from a side table, his suspicion bloomed into full-blown conviction. He knew it was her. It had to be. In his world, people like her were always looking for an angle, a way to take a piece of what he had built. He decided to prove it. He would not just fire her. He would humiliate her. He would make an example of her. Jonathan Sterling was not a man who did things by halves. He spent thousands of dollars having microscopic cameras installed throughout the house. They were hidden in air vents, in the spines of books on the library shelves, in the intricate workings of grandfather clocks, and even in the eye of a marble bust of Caesar that he was particularly proud of. He wanted to catch her red-handed. He wanted the incontrovertible proof that would justify the full force of his contempt. He would let the cameras run for a week, gathering a library of her supposed transgressions. Then, he would stage his confrontation. The perfect opportunity presented itself in the form of his annual investors' dinner. It was a night for peacocks, a gathering of men and a few women just like him, who measured their worth in stock prices and square footage. They would be the perfect audience for the drama he intended to direct. They would understand. They would applaud his decisiveness, his refusal to be taken for a fool. The night of the party arrived, a swirl of expensive perfume, clinking glasses, and a low hum of self-congratulation. Jonathan was in his element, the conductor of a symphony of wealth. He moved through the crowd, accepting compliments on his home, his portfolio, his tailored suit. But beneath the veneer of the gracious host, a cruel anticipation was building. He had reviewed some of the footage. He hadn't found her pocketing silverware or stealing cash. In fact, most of it was excruciatingly dull. It showed her reading to Leo, fixing his meals, walking with him in the garden. But there was one recurring, peculiar activity. Every afternoon, she would take Leo into the grand music room, a chamber dominated by a 9-foot concert grand piano that Jonathan had purchased as an investment, but which no one ever played. They would close the doors, and the cameras in that room, which had audio, captured long stretches of them just sitting there. Sometimes there was the sound of a few random notes being plucked, dissonant and childish. Jonathan didn't understand it, but he was certain it was a waste of time he was paying for. He decided this would be the centerpiece of his attack. He would expose her not as a thief, but as an incompetent fraud, neglecting his son to idle away the hours doing nothing. It was time. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jonathan announced, his voice slicing through the chatter, "if I may have your attention for a moment." The room quieted, the faces of his guests turning towards him, expectant. "As you know, I believe in transparency and results, in my business and in my home," he began, a smug smile playing on his lips. "And I have recently been conducting a small internal review." He gestured towards the massive screen that descended from the ceiling, usually reserved for quarterly reports and market projections. A few of his guests chuckled, sensing some corporate-style entertainment. "I've had some concerns about the welfare of my son, Leo," he continued, his tone shifting to one of feigned gravity. "Concerns about the quality of his care." He glanced towards the doorway, where a house manager stood, waiting for his signal. "Eleanor, could you come in here, please?" Jonathan called out, his voice laced with a false sweetness that was more menacing than any shout. A moment later, Eleanor appeared. She was in her simple work uniform, a stark contrast to the glittering assembly before her. She looked at the crowd of wealthy, staring faces, then at Jonathan, her own expression unreadable. She held her head high, a quiet dignity her only armor. The guests looked on, a mixture of expressions on their faces. Some looked uncomfortable, sensing the impending cruelty. Others leaned forward, their eyes gleaming with the thrill of watching someone else's misfortune. Most were simply indifferent, passive spectators in a drama that did not concern them. No one spoke up. No one met Eleanor's eyes. "Eleanor," Jonathan said, savoring the moment, "we were just discussing my son and the work you do with him." He made the word work sound like a disease. Eleanor remained silent, her hands clasped calmly in front of her. Her lack of fear, her refusal to be intimidated, was infuriating. It was like throwing a rock at a cloud. "You see," Jonathan said, turning back to his audience, "I've had some cameras installed. For security, of course. And they have captured the most interesting things." He was goading her, try to get a reaction, a flinch, a tear, something. He got nothing. Her calm was a mirror, reflecting his own ugliness back at him, and he hated her for it. "I pay you a generous salary," he spat, dropping the pretense of politeness. "I pay you to engage my son, to help him. But what do? You sit in a room for hours on end, doing nothing, wasting my money and my son's precious time." He pointed a remote at the screen. "I'm about to show my friends here exactly what I'm talking about," he sneered. "I'm about to show them what a fraud you are." He paused, his eyes narrowing. He needed to raise the stakes, to make her humiliation absolute. "Let's make this interesting," he declared. "When this video proves you are a lazy, incompetent waste of space, not only will I have you fired and blacklisted from every agency in this city, but you will sign a confession of your negligence and publicly apologize to me and my guests." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. This was more than a firing. It was a ritual of degradation. "But," he added with a contemptuous laugh, "if by some miracle this video shows you doing anything of actual value, I'll double your severance. Not that it will matter." He looked at her, expecting her to finally break, to beg, to plead. Instead, her voice, clear and steady, cut through the silence. "That is not acceptable." A murmur went through the crowd. Jonathan's face tightened in a knot of fury. "What did you say?" he hissed. "Your terms are not acceptable," Eleanor repeated, her gaze unwavering. "But I will accept the challenge." She took a step forward. The room seemed to shrink, focusing on the two of them. "If that video shows, in your own words, that I have been a lazy, incompetent waste of space. I will leave here with nothing but the clothes on my back, she said. I will not ask for a single cent. She paused, letting her words hang in the air. But if that video proves that I have done my job, that I have provided value far beyond the salary you pay me, then you will do 3 things. Jonathan was momentarily stunned into silence by her audacity. First, she continued, her voice resonating with an authority that seemed to come from nowhere, you will publicly apologize to me for this disgusting spectacle. Second, you will transfer $1 million into a trust for Leo's future education. And third, you will cede full educational and developmental guardianship of your son to me. Gasps rippled through the room. It was an utterly insane counteroffer, a declaration of war. Jonathan stared at her, his mind reeling. The woman was delusional. Who did she think she was? But in front of his peers, his rivals, his sycophants, he could not back down. To refuse her challenge would be to admit the possibility that he was wrong. And Jonathan Sterling was never wrong. A cruel, confident grin spread across his face. He was holding all the cards. He had seen the footage of them just sitting there. This would be even more satisfying than he had imagined. You have a deal, he boomed, laughing. I see you're a gambler. A foolish 1-inch. He turned to his guests. Everyone is a witness. The terms are set. Eleanor simply nodded, her expression giving nothing away. Then play the video, Mr. Sterling, she said. Her calmness was unnerving, but Jonathan dismissed it as the last gasp of a desperate woman. He pressed the button. As the screen flickered to life, Eleanor felt not fear, but a profound sadness. It had not been her choice to live this quiet life, this life in the shadows. It had been a necessity, a retreat from a world that had become too loud, too painful. Her mind drifted back, years before, to a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. She had not always been Eleanor, the nanny. She had been Dr. Eleanor Vance, a name once whispered with reverence in the halls of academia and developmental psychology. She had held degrees from 3 of the world's most prestigious universities. Her thesis on the neuroplasticity of the developing brain and its connection to musical stimuli had revolutionized the field. She had pioneered a technique, the Vance method, a way of reaching children who were locked inside themselves, autistic, traumatized, or simply neglected. She had discovered that music, in its purest mathematical and emotional form, could create new pathways in the brain, bypassing the blockages of fear and trauma. It was a language that spoke directly to the soul when words failed. She had run a world-renowned clinic, a place where desperate, wealthy parents from across the globe brought their silent, broken children. And she had performed miracles. Her life had been a whirlwind of international conferences, best-selling books, and tearful, grateful parents. Her greatest collaborator, her constant source of joy and inspiration, had been her husband, Benjamin, a gifted concert pianist. Together, they had been a force of nature. He provided the music, she provided the science, and together they healed. They had a son, Samuel, a bright, laughing boy who had his father's hands and his mother's inquisitive eyes. He was their perfect harmony, the living embodiment of their love and their work. Then, one rainy Tuesday, the music had stopped. A drunk driver, a head-on collision. Benjamin and Samuel were gone in an instant. The world of sound and theory and success that Eleanor had built crumbled into silent dust. The accolades meant nothing. The research felt hollow. The very music that had been her life's work now felt like a cruel mockery, a reminder of the melody that had been stolen from her. She had closed her clinic. She had canceled her speaking engagements. She had walked away from everything. Dr. Eleanor Vance had died on that rainy Tuesday, and in her place, Eleanor, a woman seeking silence, had emerged. For years, she had drifted, taking small, anonymous jobs. She worked as a librarian, a gardener, a companion to the elderly. She needed the simplicity. She needed to be away from the pressure and the ghosts of her former life. But the calling to help children, the core of who she was, had never truly faded. One day, while reading a financial paper she used for lining a garden bed, she saw an article about Jonathan Sterling. It mentioned his corporate ruthlessness, his recent divorce, and his reclusive 7-year-old son, Leo. Something in the boy's story, a footnote in an article about a powerful man, called to her. She saw a child drowning in a silent, gilded cage, much like the one she used to rescue. On an impulse she didn't fully understand, she had sought out the position. She had deliberately presented herself as a simple, experienced nanny, omitting the string of letters after her name, the list of publications, the lifetime of achievement. She wanted to help this one child, not as a famous doctor, but as a kind woman who understood silence. When she met Leo, she saw it instantly. The boy was not broken. He was brilliant. He was trapped, overwhelmed by a father who saw him as a flawed asset and a home that was as cold and empty as a museum after hours. Sher's silence was not a void. It was a fortress. And so, she had begun her work. The work Jonathan Sterling was about to display to the world. She knew about the cameras. She had spotted the first one within an hour of its installation, a tiny, unnatural glint in the carved wood of the music room's mantelpiece. A woman who had spent 30 years observing the minute, almost invisible cues of nonverbal children could spot a hidden lens as easily as a misplaced toy. She found the others quickly after. Her first instinct was to quit, to walk away from the insult, from the gross violation of trust. But then she looked at Leo. She saw the progress they were making, the tiny sparks of connection, the first tentative notes on the piano that were the boy's first new words in years. She could not abandon him to this man. So she had stayed, and she had planned. She knew Jonathan would not be able to resist using the footage. His arrogance was a predictable variable. She had called her old lawyer, the one who had managed her estate and the closure of her clinic. She had explained the situation, and he had, after his initial shock at hearing from her, agreed to be ready. The past was about to collide with the present. Dr. Eleanor Vance was about to be resurrected, right here in the cold heart of Jonathan Sterling's empire. And she knew, with a certainty that was as calm and deep as her grief had once been, that nothing would ever be the same. The screen lit up. The image was crisp, high definition. It showed the grand music room, the polished floor reflecting the light from the tall windows. In the center of the frame sat Eleanor and Leo, side by side on the bench of the magnificent grand piano. Jonathan Sterling leaned back, a smug look on his face. "You see," he stage whispered to the man next to him. "Nothing. Just sitting there. For hours." The video was silent at first, just the image of the woman and the boy. Leo was staring at the keys, his posture rigid, his face a small, tight mask. Eleanor wasn't looking at the piano. She was looking at Leo. Her expression was one of infinite patience, of gentle encouragement. On the screen, her voice could be heard, soft and clear. "It's okay, Leo. They're just keys. They can't hurt you. They're just waiting." Leo's small hand hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. "They are waiting for you to tell them a story," Eleanor continued. "They don't speak in words. They speak in feelings." The guests watched, a few of them shifting uncomfortably. This felt intensely private. Jonathan's smile began to look a little strained. This wasn't the damning evidence of laziness he had expected. It was quiet. Then, on the screen, Leo's finger tentatively touched a single key. A C-sharp, a lonely, questioning note. Eleanor smiled. "There. You said hello." Leo looked up at her, his eyes wide. He touched another key, then another. The notes were random, disjointed. "Ah," Eleanor said, her head tilted. "You're telling me you feel a little bit lost, a little bit jumbled. I understand that feeling." Jonathan scoffed audibly. "What is this nonsense?" She's psychoanalyzing piano clatter. But his guests were no longer looking at him. Their eyes were glued to the screen. Something was happening. Eleanor placed her hands on the keyboard, far from Leo's. She played a simple, elegant chord, a foundation of sound, warm and inviting. "How about we find a path together?" she suggested. The video then fast-forwarded snippets of days flashing by. Leo and Eleanor at the piano. Leo's random notes slowly, miraculously began to find a pattern. What started as single, hesitant taps became simple five-finger exercises. Eleanor was not just teaching him notes. She was using her method. The camera captured her explaining the color of a minor chord, the question in a dominant seventh. She was translating the abstract world of emotions into the concrete language of music. The footage slowed to a new scene, dated the day before the party. Leo was sitting at the piano, but he was different. His back was straight. His hands, no longer trembling, moved with a newfound purpose. Eleanor sat beside him, not as a teacher, but as a fellow musician. "Are you ready to tell the whole story, Leo?" she asked softly. The boy looked at her, and for the first time in 2 years, he spoke. His voice was quiet, a little rusty, but it was perfectly clear. "Yes." A collective gasp went through the room. Jonathan Sterling froze, his glass halfway to his lips. His son's voice. He hadn't heard his son's voice in 2 years. On the screen, Leo turned to the keyboard. He took a deep breath, and then he began to play. It was not a nursery rhyme. It was not a simple scale. The opening bars of Chopin's Raindrop Prelude filled the room. The melody was complex, haunting, played with a sensitivity and understanding that was utterly impossible for a 7-year-old who had supposedly never played before. The guests were mesmerized. The sound coming from the screen was sublime, a cascade of perfectly rendered sorrow and hope. They were not just watching a boy play the piano. They were watching a soul unlock itself. The camera zoomed in on Leo's face. His eyes were closed, his expression one of intense concentration, and, beneath it, a profound release. He was not just playing notes, he was speaking. He was telling the story of his loneliness, his confusion, and the hope he had found. The skill on display was astonishing. It was prodigious. The room was utterly silent, save for the music pouring from the speakers. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The whispers had died. All that existed was the music and the image of the small boy and the quiet woman beside him. Jonathan Sterling's face had gone from smugness to confusion, from confusion to denial. Now, a new expression was dawning. Panic. His eyes darted from the screen to Eleanor, who stood there, calm and resolute as a mountain. He looked at his guests. Their faces were a mixture of awe, admiration, and, as they turned to look at him, growing contempt. This was not a humiliation. It was a revelation, and he was on the wrong side of it. The prelude on the screen reached its crescendo, a storm of passionate chords, before softening again to the gentle, persistent patter of the raindrops. As the final, resonant note faded, the boy on the screen, Leo, opened his eyes and smiled. A real, genuine, joyful smile. The video ended. For a moment, the room was suspended in a stunned, echoing silence. Then, one of the guests, an elderly man in the front row, began to clap. He was joined by another, then another, until the entire room, a collection of the city's most cynical and self-interested people, erupted in thunderous, genuine applause. It was not for Jonathan. It was for the boy, and for the woman who had set him free. Jonathan stood frozen, the remote control falling from his numb fingers and clattering to the floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the suddenly quiet room. The applause died down, and the elderly man who had started it, a powerful investor named Marcus Thorne, stood up. He wasn't looking at Jonathan. He was looking at Eleanor. That was the Vance method, he said, his voice filled with disbelief and wonder. I've read the papers, seen the lectures, but I've never seen it in practice. It's a miracle. He took a step towards her. You can't be. Eleanor met his gaze and gave a small, sad smile. It has been a long time, Marcus. Thorne's jaw dropped. Eleanor? Dr. Eleanor Vance? My God, I thought you had disappeared. We all did. The name rippled through the room like a shockwave. Dr. Eleanor Vance. Even in this world of finance and industry, her name was legendary. They had friends, colleagues, wives who had spoken of her, the genius who could cure silent children, the one who had vanished after a terrible tragedy. And she had been here all this time working as a nanny. Jonathan Sterling felt the floor drop out from beneath him. The woman he had scorned, belittled, and tried to destroy was not some anonymous servant. She was a titan in her field, a legend. He was a fool, a blind, arrogant fool. "The terms of our agreement, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through his panic. It was no longer the voice of a gentle nanny. It was the voice of Dr. Eleanor Vance, a woman who commanded boardrooms and lecture halls. "I believe the first was a public apology," she stated calmly. All eyes turned to Jonathan. His face was a ghastly shade of pale, sweat beading on his forehead. This is a trick," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy. "A setup. She hired that boy." The accusation was so absurd, so pathetic, that it was met with disgusted silence. "That boy is your son, Jonathan," Marcus Thorne said, his voice cold as ice. "A son you were apparently too busy to notice was a prodigy. But that wasn't our only agreement, was it?" Eleanor continued, taking a step closer. She held up a small digital audio recorder. "You see, Mr. Sterling, you weren't the only one making recordings," she said. "I felt it was prudent to document our conversations. For security, of course." She pressed a button. Jonathan's own voice filled the room, ugly and distorted with rage, from a conversation they'd had 2 days prior. "You people are all the same, always looking for a handout. I'm going to make sure you never work in this town again. You'll be scrubbing floors for the rest of your miserable life." The recording was a vile tapestry of racial slurs, classist contempt, and explicit threats. Each word was a nail being hammered into Jonathan Sterling's coffin. His guests, his friends, shrank away from him as if he were diseased. The looks of contempt had turned to looks of pure revulsion. "And then there are the legal ramifications," Eleanor said, her voice devoid of emotion. As if on cue, the doors to the room opened. A well-dressed man in a sharp suit walked in, his face a mask of professional seriousness. He was followed by 2 uniformed police officers. "Jonathan Sterling," the man said, "my name is Daniel Porter. I am Dr. Vance's attorney. My client has recordings of your illegal surveillance, evidence of defamation, and numerous instances of workplace harassment and wrongful termination threats." The attorney gestured to the officers. "These officers are here to take your statement regarding your admission of filming a minor without the consent of his legal guardian." "Oh, wait, that's you." An interesting legal predicament. "But more pressingly," Porter continued, "several of your company's board members and primary investors happen to be in this room, and they have just witnessed your character assessment. I suspect you'll be hearing from them shortly." Jonathan looked wildly around the room. The faces of his board members were stone. Marcus Thorne, his biggest investor, simply shook his head in disgust. It was over. He knew it was over. His empire, built on a lifetime of bullying and intimidation, had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes by a quiet woman he had mistaken for a mouse. "No," he whispered, a pathetic, strangled sound. "You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll destroy you." He lunged, not at Eleanor, but toward the phone on a nearby table, his last desperate instinct to call anyone to fix this. The police officers stepped forward, blocking his path. "Sir, I think you need to calm down," one of them said, his voice firm. Jonathan Sterling, the master of the universe, the man who owned the world, finally broke. He crumpled, not like a tower, but like a paper bag, sinking to his knees on the cold, polished floor of his perfect, empty home. The public shaming was absolute. The officers did not handcuff Jonathan, but they might as well have. They escorted him from the room, a broken, babbling shell of a man, his cries of, "It's a mistake," and "I'll pay you," echoing down the marble hall. His guests, the audience he had assembled for his cruel theater, watched him go in silence. They did not look at him with pity, but with the cold, calculating appraisal of men and women cutting a bad investment loose. His fall was as swift as it was complete. When the last echo of his footsteps had faded, Eleanor Vance stood alone in the center of the room. She was no longer the invisible nanny. She was the undeniable center of gravity. She turned to the stunned crowd. "Tonight, you witnessed an act of profound ignorance," she began, her voice carrying the weight of her history and her moral authority. "You saw a man so blinded by his prejudice that he could not see the miracle happening in his own home." Her eyes swept over their faces, challenging them. "He saw a simple black woman, and he assumed I was a thief or a fool. He failed to see a teacher. He failed to see a healer. He looked at his own son, a brilliant, sensitive, and gifted child, and saw only a problem to be managed." She gestured to the now blank screen. "That is the true cost of prejudice," she declared. "It is a self-imposed blindness. It robs you of the ability to see the beauty, the potential, the magic that exists in people who are different from you. Mr. Sterling did not just try to humiliate me. He was cheating his own son of a future." She paused, letting the truth of her words sink in. "True value," she concluded, "is not measured in stock prices or square footage. It is measured in kindness. It is measured in understanding. It is measured by our ability to see the worth in every single human soul." A deep, respectful silence held the room. Then, from the doorway, a small figure appeared. It was Leo. He had been awakened by the commotion and had crept downstairs. He stood there in his pajamas, looking at the room full of strangers, his eyes searching for the one face that mattered. He saw Eleanor. A radiant smile broke across his face. He ran to her, throwing his arms around her legs and burying his face in her dress. Eleanor stooped down, ignoring everyone else in the room, and wrapped her arms around the small boy. She held him close, shielding him from the wreckage of his father's life. "It's all right, my love," she whispered, for his ears only. "The music is just beginning." 6 months later, the world looked very different. The name Jonathan Sterling was now a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and country clubs. His life had been systematically and completely dismantled. The board of Sterling Enterprises, led by a newly invigorated Marcus Thorne, had ousted him in an emergency meeting the day after the party. The public revelation of his racist tirades and illegal surveillance had made him toxic. Partners pulled out, stocks plummeted, and the empire he had built crumbled. Lawsuits, led by Daniel Porter on behalf of Dr. Vance, had stripped him of a significant portion of his fortune. The $1 million trust for Leo's education was established immediately. His friends abandoned him overnight. His calls went unanswered. His invitations were returned. The court, citing emotional neglect and the evidence from the party, had stripped him of custody of Leo, granting full educational and developmental guardianship to Dr. Eleanor Vance. The last anyone had heard, Jonathan Sterling was living in a small, rented apartment on the grim outskirts of the city he once ruled. He had been seen working as a shift manager at a discount big box store, his face gaunt, his expensive suits replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting polyester uniform. He had lost his company, his wealth, his son, his status. He was a king reduced to a pauper, haunted by the memory of a piano prelude he had been too arrogant to understand. His downfall was total, his punishment absolute. For Dr. Eleanor Vance, the 6 months had been a rebirth. The story of a nanny who was secretly a world-renowned genius had become a media sensation. But she did not bask in the fame. She leveraged it. With a substantial seed fund from her settlement and massive donations from Marcus Thorne and several other guilt-ridden guests from that fateful night, she established the Vance Sterling Institute for Child Development. The Sterling part was her idea, a permanent, institutional reminder of Jonathan's failure and Leo's triumph. The Institute was not a cold clinic. It was a warm, vibrant place filled with light, art, and music. It became the world's leading center for the Vance Method, dedicated to helping children of all backgrounds, with a special fund set aside for those whose parents could not afford the care. Eleanor was its heart and soul, no longer in hiding, but standing proudly in the light, her past tragedy fueling a renewed purpose. Her greatest success story lived with her. Leo was transformed. The silent, withdrawn boy was gone. In his place was a bright, talkative, and exceptionally happy child. His musical talent, nurtured by the best tutors the Institute could provide, had blossomed in a true genius. He composed his own pieces, his music filled with the joy and wonder he had been denied for so long. He and Eleanor were a family, their bond forged in silence and cemented in music. They lived in a comfortable, sunny house, not a mansion, but a home filled with laughter and the constant, beautiful sound of a piano being played with love. The story's impact rippled outward. Inspired by Eleanor's speech, Marcus Thorne started a corporate initiative promoting diversity and inclusion, with harsh penalties for executives who displayed prejudice. The video of Leo playing Chopin, which someone had recorded on their phone that night, went viral. It became a global symbol of hidden potential and the power of a great teacher. Eleanor's actions had not just brought down one arrogant man. They had sparked a conversation. They had forced the community of the privileged to look past their own reflections and see the humanity in those they so often ignored. The world was a better, kinder, and more musical place because a proud man had tried to humiliate a humble woman. In the end, the story of Eleanor Vance and Jonathan Sterling became a simple, powerful lesson. It taught us that a person's worth is not found in their bank account, their job title, or the color of their skin. True worth is invisible to the eyes of the arrogant. It is the dignity of a quiet soul, the brilliance of a hidden talent, the unyielding power of a good and patient heart. Prejudice does not elevate the person who holds it. It only builds a wall around their own heart, blinding them to the miracles that are waiting to unfold right in front of them, if only they had the humility to look and the grace to listen.